All right, it's time now for us to take a look back at this week's headline stories in our Reporter's Rewind. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Maria Pena. She's a Washington-based journalist who's contributed to Univision, CBS, and UPI, among other print outlets. Here in the studio, we have Raqiyah Mays, who's an entertainment reporter, blogger, and film critic here in New York. And Rosa Alonso is a technology and marketing expert and creator of the blog Rosa Alonso Digital. You can see her on Telemundo. All right, thank you so much for your time, ladies. Now, obviously, the one story dominating headlines here in the U.S. is Cuba. And, the one thing that we're all talking about is Cuba specifically. Rosa, can you tell me, what's your opinion on this?
For me, as a Cuban-born, Cuban American, it is not such a simple solution that's being offered. We don't really have the details, number one.
Yeah.
And number two, of course, the cause of the people is always what's at heart for me. And those details, what are we doing not just in trade, commerce, banking, finance, the usual? What are we doing in terms of freedom of expression and the basic human rights of the Cuban people?
Does it make sense for this to happen now?
It's interesting you say that. I'm not sure, but there is another story that's sort of sidelining this, and that is that Russia has been actively opening bases again in Cuba. There might be an underlying story why this is happening exactly now.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a parallel story that is actually developing.
Yeah. Now, Maria, you covered, Washington for a very long time, for decades. Did you see this actually coming?
Well, I certainly wasn't expecting to have a byline on a story like this. It's huge, it's transcendental, and it has political, economic, and repercussions for not just for the U.S., but for the entire region. Now, having said that, you have to be cautious because, number one, these measures will not go into effect immediately. There's a regulatory process that has to go through, the Department of Commerce, Department of Treasury. It does not mean that Americans can go on a shopping spree tomorrow and buying Cuban cigars, for instance. It does mean that, for instance, more than 250 private U.S. companies that are already doing business and trade with Cuba stand to benefit from this. Now, Rosa is mentioning that there are other issues that need to be dealt with, like the human rights situation, like freedom of the press, like freedom of assembly. But I think the whole purpose of this, and President Obama said it again in his press conference today, is to lead to a greater opening and greater reforms in the island. We have tried this embargo for more than 50 years. It has definitely not worked. It has only given the Cuban regime an excuse to continue, their tactics in the island. So there's a lot of hope, a lot of skepticism as well. But I think it is a good beginning for all involved.
All right, Maria, let's just give a chance to Raqiyah on this. I mean, you're, of course, looking at this from an online perspective as well.
Yes.
What are your thoughts?
I think what we're talking about and what people are talking about is Assata Shakur. That is the conversation going on right now. A Black Panther who in the 1970s was on the New Jersey Turnpike, and there's an argument. A police officer was killed. She said that she was shot in the front and the back with her hands up. Either way, she was found guilty, was put in jail, and then was able to escape and found freedom in Cuba. So now what people are saying, because of this new relationship with Cuba, as beautiful as it is, we've definitely made inroads. They are concerned that the New Jersey State Police will resume their hunt, which they have said earlier this week via statement that they will, to find Assata Shakur.
Now, let's stick and move on rather to Sony being attacked.
Yes.
North Korea officially named today as the bad guys here.
Right.
Did you see this coming at all?
I initially thought it was an inside job.
Yeah.
Before this was unveiled, we found that Sony had laid off numerous employees. A lot of these employees were in the IT department. And so people wondered what was going on.
Yeah.
And, some of us, we still believe that it was an inside job. Some say perhaps North Korea was on the inside.
Yeah.
And now with this movie, The Interview, and they've canceled the release, and people are wondering, and Obama came out today and said he wished that Sony hadn't done it. I think Sony was just thinking about their moviegoers and wanting to save people.
Yeah. Rosa, what are your thoughts on this? The fact that this has happened now, and President Obama says it was a big mistake. this means more people are going to watch it when it does eventually come out, right?
Yes. There's that little PR. No such thing as bad PR. I should say Sony that has a history of issues with security, online security. If you recall, back in 2011, the PlayStation was hacked by a disgruntled person who was actually back coding and trying to actually sell games illegally that weren't Sony games on the PlayStation.
Yeah.
They have issues with security. We're not sure. I always believe that in major hacks like this, there is some inside element to it because there's major money on the table.
Yeah.
There is evidence that there's code used, similar code, the forensic analyst to the North Korea to South Korea hack.
Yeah.
But I still believe that corporations in the U.S. really have to think very carefully about their structure and security. Because there are a lot of breaches taking place. And this is just one of the many companies in the last few years that have been.
Yeah, I mean, we have very little time here, but I want to get you in, Maria, because you're in Washington. What can the U.S. do to make a difference here or even take any action against North Korea, if at all any?
Well, President Obama today was very clear that, number one, Sony should not have caved in to threats from abroad and censorship, because this is what it's definitely cost. And he's going to talk to Congress to get bills going for strengthening cybersecurity. I think the main takeaways from this are precisely how do you protect private companies from cybersecurity threats, because today it was Sony. Tomorrow it could be Wall Street or any other part of our infrastructure. So I think one of the main takeaways is how do you make sure that companies are protected from cyber attacks? The other takeaway is you don't cave in to threats from abroad because that creates censorship. What if this was just a satirical movie? What if they object to a documentary or to our own reporting as journalists? So we have to be cautious of that.
Maria, thanks for that. And we have to leave it right there. And thanks for joining us in Washington. And of course, you ladies here in our New York studios.
Thank you very much.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Now you're watching Arise America.